Joining this Roundtable 2 on the outcome of the Innovate4Cities Conference. And we have an audience online, and we have an increasing number of people here in the room which are coming in. And welcome everyone from my side. My name is Sebastian Lange. I'm working with UN Habitat. I'm a focal point for climate change and environment with the Planning, Finance and Economy section. So I'm also part of the extended climate team of UN Habitat. And today we want to talk about the Innovate4Cities Conference from a global perspective perhaps, but also then with a regional touch to it. And the Innovate4Cities Conference was an international gathering at the nexus of cities, climate change, science and innovation. It was a groundbreaking meeting that was co-hosted by UN Habitat and the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, also known as GCOM, and it took place from 11 to 15 October 2021. It was held as a virtual, multi-day, global and regional event, and it brought together about 7,000 registered participants. This is incredible. And I saw the statistics this morning. There were about 22,000 people that have actually logged on. So this is like really good resonance that the conference has gathered online. Who were the participants? We had city leaders, scientists, researchers, innovators, academics and youth, and also business people that were advancing the pragmatic, action-oriented research agenda. And the objective was, of course, to reduce the carbon footprint of cities and to increase resilience to climate change. The first Cities and Climate Change Science Conference took place in 2018, and there were about 800 participants in Edmonton in Canada, and the outcome of that conference in 2018 were three main or most important documents: the Global Research and Action Agenda on climate, on cities and climate change science, and the GCOM's Innovate4Cities initiative to drive climate action in cities, and also the Edmonton Declaration on Climate Change, which was signed by over 3,400 cities. Now, as a follow-up to the 2018 Edmonton Conference, Innovate4Cities took place in 2021, and the aim was, as I mentioned, to bolster knowledge and solution implementation and to mobilize the transformative potential of cities towards zero carbon and climate resilient development. One of the innovation pathways that the I4C Conference pursued and still is pursuing is the co-creation approach beyond the science agenda, and particularly in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are still facing. Cities will play an integral part for identifying knowledge and innovation gaps and for facilitating the cooperation and for securing green investments in transitioning to a more just, healthier, safer and sustainable world. Now, the roundtable today, at the occasion of today's World Cities Day, will provide a first look on the outcome of the I4C Conference, just 2 weeks after its conclusion. We are going to analyze key outcomes from the conference as a potential input to the wider debate on climate change, and potentially also as an input to the discussion at COP26, which begins today concurrently in Glasgow. And the inputs or the outcome from the I4C conference may also have an impact on the 7th assessment cycle of the IPCC, and subsequently the special report on climate change in cities that is going to come up in the near future. Moreover, we have two distinguished panelists here with us today in the room. Professor Ahmed Rashed from the British University in Cairo, an architect and expert on sustainable building practice. And we have Dr. Najib Shubash, who is an expert in public health and who has worked with WHO for over 27 years and who is still instrumental in shaping future strategies for public health in the region. Welcome to the panel, both of you. And together we'll try to reflect upon the outcome of the I4C conference from a regional perspective and thematically from the viewpoint of sustainable building practice and public health. Two topics that are not entirely disconnected and that are both relevant in the context of climate change adaptation. So then we'll have some time to discuss also with the audience online and with the audience here present in the room afterwards. So we'll have first some thematic input from our panelists online, which I'm going to introduce in a moment, and then I would like to actually open the more formal presentation format to a discussion, and then hopefully we have an interesting feedback and Q&A with the attending people. Now let's jump right into the panel discussion on the I4C outcome. Maybe a few remarks on our distinguished panelists online, starting with distinguished Professor Xuemei Bai from the Australian National University in Canberra. Welcome, Xuemei. Glad to have you here. Xuemei is a distinguished professor of urban environment and human ecology at the Fenner School of Environment and Society, and her research focuses on a variety of topics, including climate change and low carbon transition, and more recently also on the Anthropocene futures and Earth system sustainability. Professor Bai is a member of the Earth Commission, leading its working group 5, and she is co-chair of Future Earth Knowledge, Urban Knowledge, of the Future Earth Urban Knowledge Action Network, which was launched in 2016 at Habitat 3 in Quito, the Habitat 3 conference. She has served as a lead author for several global assessment reports, including the IPCC AR6 with Working Group 3 on mitigation to climate change. Professor Bai was named as one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate change policy in 2019. And she will offer us perspective on the outcome from the conference on the global research and on the global research and action agenda. Welcome again. Then secondly, we have here with us Seth Shultz. Seth is the CEO of Resilience Shift, a catalyst for positive change whose mission is to help ensure the safety and continuity of critical infrastructure and services that make our life possible. Welcome, Seth. Some of his recent work was focused on creating a space race era mobilization of resources and development, research and development on cities and climate change through indeed the creation of the Innovate4Cities Conference together with the Global Covenant of Mayor, and other roles that Seth held recently include the senior advisor to the Museum of the United Nations and global director for science innovation at the I4C Climate Leadership Group. He founded also the Coalition for Urban Transition and served as a lead author on the groundbreaking IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, which came out, I believe, 2 years ago or 3. One of the most important documents that came out in the recent years. Seth serves also on numerous advisory committees and boards and is a frequent author and lecturer. Seth is currently based in the Hudson River Valley in New York with his wife and 3 children. Welcome to the panel. Thank you for joining us, and it's great to have you here today. Now, going to our third panelist, Dr. Mauricio Rodas. Mauricio has previously worked with the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and later as a policy consultant for the Mexican government. And then in 2014, upon his return to Ecuador, he was elected Mayor of Quito and served a term from 2014 to 2019. And during his tenure, Mauricio did also host the UN Conference on Sustainable Urban Development, Habitat 3, the most important urban conference of the decade in 2016 in Quito. Some of you might have been there. I was there too. It was a very great host city, the city of Quito, for us, UN Habitat, with the Habitat 3 conference, and of course the world as a whole. And he has also served in various city networks and leadership positions. For instance, 2 terms at the at UCLG as World Co-President, and he is a member of the board of the I4C Climate Leadership Group. He was involved in ECLAY and also is involved in the Global Government of Mayors for Climate and Energy. In this capacity, he is also perhaps representing the I4C conference on this panel. Now, currently, Mauricio is a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, the Penn Institute for Urban Research and the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, and he's working on the city's climate resilience infrastructure finance initiative. In 2019, he was also named one of the 100 world's most influential people on climate action. He also received the UPenn's University of Pennsylvania's World Urban Leadership Award. Welcome to the panel. Lastly, I would also like to introduce, last but not least, Indy Johan, who is an architect and co-founder of quite a number of projects, including Project 00 and most recently the project called Dark Matter, which is a field laboratory focusing on radically redesigning the bureaucratic and institutional infrastructure of our cities, regions and towns. Quite an important task, I would say, for more democratic, distributed, and a great transformation or transition that is to happen. Dark Matter works with institutions around the world, including UNDP, McConnell, TfL, GLA in London, and the Blocks Hub in Copenhagen. And Indy has co-founded on behalf of the Project 00 multiple social ventures from the Impact Hub in Westminster to the Impact Hub in Birmingham, along with working with large global multinationals and institutions to support the transition to a positive system economy. And he also co-led research projects such as the Compendium for the Civic Economy. And Indy is also a non-executive director of the WikiHouse Foundation, trustee to the Royal Institute of British Architects, and advisor to the Mayor of London for Good Growth. And he lectures at various universities, including Bath, the TU Berlin, the Architects Association, the University College London, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, and New School. So welcome also to you. Very glad to have you here on the panel. Yeah, so perhaps we should then start with our discussion. I'm going to introduce you a bit later. So the first presentation, we're going to have 4 presentations now, short presentations and a bit of discussion that also comes with it. And perhaps Professor Bai, maybe I can ask you to take the lead with the first slot and tell us a little bit about the impact from the I4C conference on the research agenda, and then we'll have also the chance to maybe exchange a few words afterwards. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. And Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here today. And before I start speaking about the research agenda, I would also like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands I'm joining today, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. So in order to really talk about what's new in this new I4C conference, I really have to look back briefly on the Edmonton meeting. As mentioned by Sebastian, the Edmonton meeting was the first ever science conference on cities and climate change sponsored by IPCC. And we had over 700-800 participants, mostly from scientific community, but also including knowledge brokers, NGOs, and local government officials and practitioners. Now, I must say that the conference really played an essential role in mobilizing scientific community to pay more attention to the topic, and with the aim to really inspire and perhaps even direct the research on the topic of cities and climate change, and to generate substantial output in order to inform the IPCC's special report on climate change and cities, which is decided to occur during the early part of the 7th IPCC assessment cycle. So towards the running up to the Edmonton meeting, the scientific steering committee of the Edmonton Conference has got together and identified 6 research priorities for cities and climate change. I'll try to share my screen. Okay, this is not able. Anyway, so we identified these 6 research priorities for cities and climate change, and we published this in Nature just a couple of days before the Edmonton conference. So the 6 research priorities really include, the first one is expand observation, because researchers and city authorities really need to extend the quality and types of urban data collected in order to for them to inform them their decision making in practice. And the second priority we identified was to understand climate interactions, because climate processes are really complex, and so much so in cities, and they also interact with many other urban processes. And the third priority we identified was study the informal settlement. We know by 2050, 3 billion people were living in informal settlement, and enabling these communities to adapt is a priority, as poor housing and infrastructure really compound the risks. And the fourth research priority we identified was harness disruptive technology. We know there are many new technologies happening, especially in cities, for example, the digital revolution, low carbon building materials and things like that. We really need to make sure that these technologies can really deliver benefit, and also at the same time manage the trade-offs of using these technologies. And the fifth priorities we identified was the need to support transformation, because we really need some bold strategies to achieve the low carbon resilient city. And we really need to find, understand, and scale up many of the successful local innovations. And the 6 research priorities we identified then was to recognize the global sustainability context, because we all know that climate change, although it's really severe and urgent and a really big problem, it's just one part of a very complex and intertwined many of the other global challenges. So integrating these 6 research priorities were identified with the many presentations and deliberations occurred during the conference. A global research and action agenda was produced subsequently. So I cannot really show the figure, but the structure of this global research and action agenda had 3 parts. The first part is really showing the key cross-cutting issues and knowledge gaps for a step change of knowledge generation on cities and climate change. And this, sorry, just a moment. And these include, for example, the governance issue, city-level models and data and systems approach, as well as how to scale things up. And then the second layer of this includes several topical research areas that are where some of the research will need to happen in order to really inform the actions. And these include, for example, urban planning and design, built and green blue infrastructure, sustainable consumption and production, finance, informality, and uncertainty. So we really need to advance research in those 6 areas. And then the last layer is represents 3 suggested approaches that may facilitate the implementation of this research and action agenda. And this includes, for example, partnerships for long-term collaboration and co-production of knowledge, and really encouraging cities to take actions. So the I4C conference that we just had a couple of weeks ago is really a sequel to this Edmonton conference. And as Sebastian just mentioned, the conference has over 7,000 registrations, almost 10 times of the first conference. And I think the I4C has really provided a great opportunity to build on and see to what extent the identified research priorities and agenda were advanced, what are the emerging hot topic areas, and what are the remaining sort of challenges. So looking at the sessions and presentations of this I4C, we could really see there has been significant interest in the areas of urban planning and design, systems approach, understanding and integrating climate and urban processes, and positioning climate change in the broader societal goals and challenges, and a much stronger regional focus, perhaps thanks to the online-based conference, which eliminated the need for travel and associated funding requirement, etc. So in terms of new area of research focus, probably one thing that really stood out was really the increasing interest on the local and indigenous knowledge and how we can actually integrate them into the mainstream climate change science, policy, and practice. And probably this is also reflecting the broader trend that is happening within the environmental and sustainability science community, where the local and indigenous knowledge is increasingly recognized as a really important and legitimate form of knowledge that has so much more to offer to the mainstream science. So I think a more systematic synthesis of the conference and analysis in relationship with the GRAA is still underway. But what we can already say is that all of the identified research priorities and key research focal areas suggested in the GRAA are still very strongly relevant. We really need to progress in all of these identified and emerging directions that I just mentioned, and with some areas might need boosted effort than others towards the city's special report of IPCC Area 7. And here I think I would really like to highlight 4 key areas of research going forward. I think first of all, the world is a very different place now compared to pre-Edmonton time. And there are a strongly growing societal awareness on climate change risks and the need for urgent action now. And cities has been really playing a key role in building and growing this momentum. More than 800 cities worldwide has already pledged to net zero emission target by 2030 or 2050. And in some countries, these local actions has not only put pressure to the national government, but also gave them the confidence, I would say, for them to subsequently commit to also to net zero target. So after all, I mean, if most of these major cities in their country achieve the net zero target, then the national government wouldn't have too much difficulty in just jumping onto this net zero emission bus. But of course, setting target is not enough. We really need to make sure that cities can actually achieve these ambitions. So for this to happen, we really need to have more locally based, transdisciplinary research to build knowledge on the internal works of these frontier cities and understand their key barriers to achieving the net zero ambitions and find out concrete and actionable policy and practice options. And this really requires engaging local government and other stakeholders and co-design and co-produce knowledge. Secondly, we still don't have a good grasp on how to achieve climate adaptation in informal settlement. Because as I said, by 2050, there will be more than 3 billion people living in informal settlements. And these populations are also the most vulnerable to climate impacts. We have this dual challenge here, for example, which is, while greatly enhancing the living conditions of these informal settlements, we also need to rapidly prepare these areas to the imminent climate-induced hazard and disasters. And research into the adaptation and mitigation challenges of these settlements will need to happen at a much larger scale and at a much faster pace. The third area I would like to highlight is that we still really don't know how to build our cities without too much carbon consequences, while providing sufficient infrastructure services to the rapidly growing urban residents, mostly in the global south. Our work has shown that if we are to provide the same per capita level of infrastructure to all existing and incoming urban residents in the global south, and if this infrastructure are built with traditional technologies, then it will entail about 226 gigatons of CO2. And this is a huge amount. Simply compare this to the remaining carbon budget of, let's say, 500 to 800 gigatons, depending on how you calculate and where you draw the line, which is the budgets that were to achieve the Paris Agreement. So the 226 is almost half or 1/3 of this entire remaining carbon budget. But this is also mostly neglected in emission scenarios, analysis and things like that. And we haven't really found a good solution how to avoid this kind of embodied carbon emission as yet. And the last area of gap I would like to highlight is our systems approach. For example, we know that nature-based solutions, such as enhancing the urban blue-green infrastructure, are receiving a lot of attention these days. It can be a very good option, a great option actually, to address extreme heat in cities, reduce inner-city flood, while enhancing the physical and mental health and well-being of urban residents. It also has great potential to address both climate change and biodiversity conservation goals in cities. But how to effectively integrate this infrastructure at scale to engineering-based solutions to maximize the benefit remains to be uncovered. And more broadly, taking an integrated systems approach in not only infrastructure, but across urban planning, governance, and practice remain a challenge. There are increasing awareness on the need for systems approach, but there are very few research that actually can show the concrete carbon reduction effect or other benefits of such approach, and far too little good examples in practice. So we really need to build scientific knowledge and accumulate examples of innovative and successful practices of this systems approach. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Bai. This was very interesting, and indeed, it's actually good to know that the GRAA has been largely confirmed by the I4C conference. It means that Edmonton was getting us onto the right way or the right track, and that now with the I4C conference we actually were able to develop this further internationally with all the different partners that attended. I mean, 22,000 people that joined, 7,000 registered participants. Yeah, and of course, the focus, I'm saying this from a UN Habitat perspective, the focus on the urban poor is also something that is, it is good to see that actually there is now an increasing focus on this. We have, of course, always advocated for the urban poor, but we also particularly brought this to the attention at the 2019 conference, Climate Action Summit in New York, with one of the initiatives that we proposed to build climate resilience for the urban poor. And we also tried back of the envelope calculation of how many people are affected, and it's quite significant. So thank you very much. We'll have time and a chance to discuss further a little bit ahead in the session. Now, before I go to the next panel, I need to do one little thing. I apologize that I have not recognized Dr. Mahdi. I have mentioned him at the beginning, but I also wanted to officially welcome him. He is the Secretary General of the Supreme Council for Planning and Development in Kuwait, and is therefore also instrumental to push forward the agenda of sustainable building development in the region from Kuwait. So accept my apology, Dr. Mahdi. I'll give a few words more about you when we go into the regional panel. But for now, please let us stay a little more with the I4C conference, and I would like to give the floor to Seth Shultz from the Resilience Shift. Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here with all of you. Sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. I'm actually I'm traveling today on my way to COP26 in Glasgow, so otherwise I would have been there with you. But thank you for having us, and for giving us an opportunity to talk about some of the exciting things that just happened out of the Innovate4Cities Conference. My colleague Xuemei just gave a wonderful overview and some history and context with regards to how this started in Edmonton and what we've just seen happen over the last couple of weeks with regard to the conference. For my remarks, and I'll try to keep them brief so we can engage more in the panel discussion, but I wanted to zoom in a little bit on the practicality of what this all means. Again, as Xuemei kind of clearly outlined, the time frame, the scale, some of the challenges, I think what's exciting that's beginning to happen with regard to this Innovate4Cities is the commingling of perspectives. So increasingly, because of the multiple challenges that we do face, relying on what we've done in the past is not going to be a solution that is going to work moving forward. We need to have different perspectives, different understandings if we're to meet the challenges and implement at the scale and the speed and have the transformational results that we need. Associated with that, what is really exciting and foundational about the Innovate4Cities approach is a co-generation. So this isn't just academia looking at publishing reports. This isn't just about city and policymakers, and this isn't just about businesses. These are about these key communities of practice coming together, helping understand and learn from each other, offering their perspective and their knowledge, and putting that together in a way that will result the solutions that we need. And what Innovate4Cities is doing is that by bringing these perspectives together, we're getting a more holistic viewpoint of what those gaps are. So not just gaps in the literature and the academia, not just a gap in terms of what the finance issues are, or not a gap in terms of policy or technology that's needed to implement this, but when we can take a more holistic view, we can dial in much more quickly and much more accurately on where are the items that we need to engage and how we do that from a holistic perspective. Again, multiple levels of government, national, regional, and local, as well as the value chain of how those projects get implemented, which is going from procurement to design to implementation to owning and operating. And it's across the entire value chain that we need to understand what we're doing and how we're doing it and have a very radically different approach. Xuemei was talking about business as usual. Another interesting way to think about this is that if we continue building out the infrastructure and decarbonizing that we need to achieve, but if we do that the way we've been doing it, by 2040, we will have more physical man-made infrastructure than we will on natural habitat. by 2040. I mean, it's an absolutely astronomical thing to think about. But at the same time, we do not have enough resources to continue, intensive resources to continue the intensive mechanism of building things. There's just not enough concrete and steel that we can manufacture to do this. And we have to do it in a way, as we're decarbonizing, that is also resilient or future-proofed. If we throw everything at this in the next decade, as the science clearly indicates, to create a carbon neutral society, but we do that without resilience and adaptation built into it, decarbonized infrastructure will be the 21st century stranded assets, which we can't allow to have happen. So we have to come at this from a totally different perspective. And then again, going back to some of the things that we saw come out of this conference, what these issues are starts bubbling up and emerging and becoming much clearer. For one very, very simple example, we have an issue of downscaling information and data, which is pretty striking, that given where we are, in human history, where we have more information and data available to us than ever before, we're still struggling with downscaling that information into a level of detail that is actually usable and implementable at a local level, i.e. cities, where we need to build, design, and as Xuemei said, we still don't get how to build cities correctly. So we need to understand what the right mixture of density is, transit-oriented development, green space, parks, and we need to do this in a way that is, experimenting in real time. But as a result, we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. I think we need to change incentives on how we design, build, and manage these things. We have to lean into the failure that's required for us to learn at a rapid pace and accelerate and reinvent ourselves as we're doing this. But going back again to downscaling the information and data, some of the work that we're doing with the IPCC and the integrated models assessments are yielding better and better climactic data, but a lot of that sits at the regional level. Some of the most sophisticated approaches to take that regional climactic data and downscale it is happening at a resolution of about 120 kilometers, as an example. Now, if you take information like that and take it to a city, that's not very helpful. A city is a couple of square miles. Maybe it's 15, 20 square miles if it's a very, very large city. But again, getting information that's 120 kilometers in resolution is not helpful. It needs to be downscaled to a meter or two of resolution if you really want to take serious action on implementing that and converting it into policy. So there's a huge opportunity and role for the private sector, for technology, to help solve these problems, but again, they need to be guided on what is necessary, and that's why bringing these different communities of practice is helpful. So as a city practitioner can sit down and say, these are the issues that I need, this is the information, the knowledge, and the data that I need in order to then roll out the policies and create the projects. But without that understanding in the upfront process and development, we're not going to get there quickly enough. And at the same time, we can sit down with companies. And from a company's perspective, we can understand what technology they have, what solutions they can deploy. But we need to listen to companies about the procurement problems, the design problems, the inability for companies or engineers that have the expertise on getting the ideas and solutions into the upstream development of those RFPs or those procurement practices. Oftentimes, if a company has some information and knowledge that can help a government figure out what to do, if they provide that information to them, that company is then precluded from bidding on the work downstream because it's a conflict of interest. So as a result, we're not getting the information and knowledge that we need where it exists in a timely process. One of the other things that I think the Innovate4Cities Conference is also helping us realize is that we need a shift in perspective in terms of thinking about outputs to thinking about outcomes. And again, this goes back to how we've incentivized and how our processes are designed and built. But rather than thinking about designing a request to build a bridge, we need to think about designing a request that is going to connect communities. That's what I mean about shifting from an output to an outcome. And if we think about what that piece of infrastructure is providing in terms of connectivity, in terms of transfer of goods and services, in terms of emergency egress in the time of a disaster, that will come to radically different solutions that are just looking at that as a concrete and steel piece of infrastructure that needs to be designed in a certain amount of time with a certain level of risk tolerance. And sticking with this example, another thing that's yielding is how we need to change and evolve our codes and standards. Codes and standards play an absolutely pivotal role in design and implementation and construction all over the world. However, those standards are becoming calcified. Just as a small example, it takes on average about 5 to 6 years to create a new standard in the engineering community. And it takes about another 4 or 5 to then get it used and understood. So that's roughly a 10-year time frame. So how are we supposed to decarbonize and do things we've never done in 10 years if it takes us 10 years just to create a new standard? It will not work. And we need to stop creating standards based on hard certainties and understand that the future is filled with uncertainties and come up with standards that are more probabilistically built rather than finite, and treat uncertainty very differently. Most times in our models and approaches to uncertainty, we either build parameters and design it down and over-engineer it to take it into account, or we simply just, our models don't allow us to accept the uncertainty and they get developed without them. So I think these are, Sebastian, these are some of the really practical, very fundamental things that are yielding some really fascinating insights associated with the Innovate4Cities Conference, because we've got all these different communities of practice coming to the table and saying, this is great, but we need this X, Y, or Z. And when you put those together, you can start seeing a much more comprehensive path forward on what we need to do, that we actually do have a lot of the innovation, a lot of the experience, and a lot of the technology. It's just not in the right place at the right time in the right sequence. So that in one way, that's good news. In another way, there's a lot of work that we have to do to significantly realign ourselves on how we're doing things, why we're doing things, and the speed at which we will allow that to happen, and the level of failure that is acceptable along that pathway. So those are just a couple of quick thoughts from me, Sebastian, and I'm really looking forward to the additional discussion and dialogue. Back over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these insights. It sounds to me almost as if we are to reinvent a lot of things. I mean, as we are grasping the extent of the change that is necessary in order to tackle climate change, I mean, change in our societies and the way we are, I mean, like you mentioned, the codes and standards, for instance, the way we are processing these things, but also in technology and green procurement and so forth. So I have the feeling that we are absolutely not fit for purpose at the moment to neither to mitigate enough greenhouse gas emissions on scale, and to then adapt to possible impacts that are happening. So it's actually quite a timely call to think innovation also from that angle, that we are able to respond on scale and in time. You know, we don't have 20 years or 30 years left. We need to basically do the major changes that are necessary in the next 10 to 15 years, perhaps. So, yeah, and I'm very glad that the I4C conference actually brought these things up, because that is a slightly different perspective I want to add to, let's say, the mainstream or standard research approach. And I very much also like the idea of communities of practice that are interdisciplinary, but also bringing together actors from the private sector and from research, from government and so forth, which is what the I4C conference has already been pioneering. Now, I want to hand over to our next panelist, former mayor of Quito and involved in many cities networks still, Dr. Mauricio Rodas. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's great to be speaking to all of you today. I regret the fact that I am not able to be there in person, but just like Seth mentioned, I am also on my way to COP26 in Glasgow. It is a great opportunity to talk about what was highlighted during the I4C conference 2 weeks ago. I think that once again, I4C became a great platform to make the connection between research and science with urban policy design to address issues like climate change and resilience, capability building at the city level. I think that in that regard, there were probably three key messages from the I4C conference thinking about COP26. So the first one is about the need to strengthen cities' capacities and preparation for implementation of projects. There's a big gap in the implementation side of things in cities. When you think about, for example, the development of climate resilient projects, there's a lack of technical capacity on part of cities' staff to design projects. There's a need to develop better technical assistance mechanisms for cities in order for them to be in a better shape for project preparation and the development of big infrastructure projects. The second one has to do with incorporating a sustainable development and climate resilient driven approach to infrastructure projects. I think that's really important as a key component of a comprehensive urban development plan. The importance also of vertical integrate NDC implementation by strengthening local investments, multi-level governance that enables local action and address local needs. Of course, the issue of justice and equity is also very important in this regard, right? How to put equity as a center of all urban climate solutions, particularly regarding adaptation. Now, when talking about this, it is fundamental that urban planning and design of new and existing areas in cities should integrate climate mitigation and adaptation benefits, as well as a people focus on urban developing planning. Of course, the importance as well of coordinating mechanisms between different levels of government for planning, for urban planning, and to implement effective climate resilient solutions. Now, the third key message has to do with the fact that cities are perfect places for innovation and creativity. We should take advantage of that. And I think that cities have proven once again to be at the forefront of dealing with some of the most global pressing issues, like what happened with COVID-19, right? And we saw examples around the world of very bold and disruptive mayors taking effective action, even much more so than national governments in many cases, to protect their population from the pandemic. Now, I think we should take advantage of the fact that cities can be bold, that cities can be innovative in order to come up with effective solutions to address climate change and to build resilience. In that regard, of course, the issue of finance is absolutely key. We are dealing with an international financial architecture that was designed for countries. It was not designed for cities. And it's urgent to make it more cities friendly. I think that we can have now a great opportunity to do that because many developed countries have set up recovery packages, COVID-19 recovery packages. And that could mean the opportunity for cities to receive a lot of resources to develop climate resilient infrastructure. Unfortunately, as of today, we have not seen in most cases that a big portion of that money has gone into cities. I think we still have time. I still think we have time to develop mechanisms for those recovery packages to be, in a big part, dispersed directly into cities for them to develop the kind of climate resilient infrastructure that is needed if we want cities to become an effective player to support countries to meet their NDCs and to meet the Paris Agreement. It will be impossible for countries to meet their NDCs and the Paris Agreement goals without an effective role from cities, because it is in cities where more than 70% of CO2 emissions are taking place. But if we want cities to play that effective role, we need to provide them with resources, financial resources that in most cases cities as of today are not able to get, particularly in the developing world. Why? Because first of all, of a lack of a proper regulatory framework for that. In many countries, cities are not even allowed to borrow money. In some other countries, cities can have access to finance, but with a national government's guarantee. A national government guarantee that might not be granted because of political rivalries between the national and the local government. In some other places, cities just lack the technical capacity, as I mentioned before, to develop bankable projects, or they lack the necessary level of credit worthiness to access to resources. So all of these issues are affecting cities when it comes to trying to access financial resources to develop climate-friendly projects. And we need to discuss this kind of thing. That's why this space is so valuable, to talk about these issues and to think about ways in which cities would be in a better shape to become drivers to tackle climate change. And last but not least, regarding finance, I think it is important to, and this was highlighted during the conference, the importance of the private sector. We need to attract more private sector investment into cities. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not happening in most of the developing world countries. Why? First of all, because private sector is not familiar with the way cities operate to develop projects. We need to provide better information about cities' initiatives to the private sector and to make them realize that projects at the urban level to address issues like climate change can be profitable to the private sector. We need to come up with, once again, technical capacity for develop this kind of attractive projects, but also we need to improve regulatory frameworks to make them more friendly to the private sector. In many of the countries in the developing world, we see regulatory frameworks for example, to implement public-private partnerships that are extremely difficult to implement, very complex, very complicated to understand. So I think that international financial institutions, UN agencies, think tanks, the academia, research institutions can do a great work for developing benchmarking exercises to identify success stories and best practices regarding private sector investment in cities in order to improve regulatory frameworks that would make them more easier to implement in order to attract private sector money into cities. So I'll stop here. These are some of the main ideas that were discussed as takeaways for local authorities during the I4C conference. Sebastian, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mauricio, and especially for also pointing the emphasis towards finance. I mean, money makes the world go round is of course an old saying, but the more important, if we are tackling a global change in response to the climate crisis, we also need to talk about funding. And if we want to talk about being successful in this endeavor, we need to talk about the role of cities. And cities in most cases have difficulties to access funding directly. I mean, there are, like you mentioned, different aspects in it. I very much like the idea of, the involvement of the private sector and maybe the tackling of the problem in developing countries. There is, of course, a lot of private sector investments, but the question here is how can we maybe approach a public-private partnership involving the private sector, the public sector that is able to breach that barrier of sub-sovereign lending and that allows the cities to maybe access funding. We often hear that it is a question of risk. We often hear that the capacity for absorbing funds is not there, but somehow I think that is a suspicion on my side, is that we are not trying hard enough in actually finding these solutions. So I would very much like to talk about a little more on that question of funding later. Now we have one more panelist from the I4C conference organizers, and I'd like to welcome Indy Johar to talk about the very important and interesting and challenging question of innovation, perhaps of institutions, etc. So Indy, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Firstly, it's been a pleasure listening to everyone. I think we've got some very, very good things on the table. I'm going to add, just to build on a few of those points very, very quickly. One, I think that came across very clearly in the conference was that actually we need to talk about planetary urbanism shifts as well. So we often talk about shifts in a city, but what we're likely to have is somewhere near at least 500 million people on the move in the next maybe 30 to 40 years. So when we start to see that scale of mobility and shift around the world, I think our theory of what urbanism looks like and whether that ends up being informal urbanism or where we end up talking about large-scale development, new cities, I think we have to start to think very seriously about the replacement of our existing urban infrastructure. We're already seeing that in Indonesia and other places. So how do we start to think about that? The planetary scale urbanism shifts, I think, are going to be very, very significant. And I mean that both sort of between geographies, but also within geographies. So so UK, for example, lost nearly 800,000 people over COVID, and I don't think those 800,000 people are coming back to London specifically. So London particularly lost something like 800,000 people. So what is the new people economic geography? Second, I want to add is that there was one of the kind of reflections that I would like to add is our ability to make decisions. IPCC has been giving us the facts for every 2 years. But actually the problem is no longer the facts. The problem is we do not have the capacity to make decisions. So there's nothing, it's not like we've not known any of this stuff. We've known this stuff for many, many years. So we're fundamental failure in making decisions and how we make decisions. And I would say there's some very structural issues about how our current frameworks of democracy or organizing states actually are empowering incumbents and allowing for violence into the future. And that means that actually fundamentally there's a decision-making structure problem of what does 21st century parliamentary systems and decision-making models look like. Three, I want to talk about we can start talking a lot about financial infrastructure. What's very clear in a lot of the work that's happening is that most of our risks are unpriced. So we can start to talk about how we deal with those risks, but the reality is if those risks are not priced, actually it's very difficult to allow capital to flow against that. So most of our climate change risks are unpriced. And by implication, there is very little scope to invite private capital to the table. And I think we need to start to acknowledge that because there is a fundamental financial question at the center of this. When we talk about $4.5 trillion a year required, I think we have to understand that there's some structural issues on that side. And this is what I mean by the scale of capital required. I think this was alluded to earlier by previous speakers. The scale of capital required is fundamentally of a proportion more akin to a world war than it is akin to gradual urban evolution. So we have to start to think about capital mobilization in a fundamentally different way, and we need to look back at history to look at where resources have been mobilized. Second, I think the decentralization and distribution of capital production. So it is clear that centralized capital production by programs which are highly centric in design aren't able to deal or deliver against the complex needs of our local environments. And I think that is a fundamental issue. So how we decentralize capital production in novel frameworks, which are like distributed quantum easing frameworks, underwritten structures, all sorts of mechanisms that are going to have to be built to build that resilience capability. But fundamentally, I suppose what I want to say is that what I worry about most, and this is in a way my closing remarks to this point so we can get into a discussion, is I feel like we think this is an evolutionary transition. I think we're at the cusp of a structural transition. A structural transition. And we keep selling the ideas of cities in the same 19th century way of let's get more human density and somehow that's the solution. And we know that's not even the solution. And we know actually we're going to see some fundamental shifts in the economic geography of how the world of work, economic production operates. We know that most of our material economy and energy economy isn't going to be able to give us the quantum of materials required to deal with the large-scale informal settlements that we already have and are necessary. So I think we're facing a fundamental question in the nature of how we think about cities. What is a city? How is value formed in the city? And and I would say, all the historic or the last sort of frameworks of urban economics and aggregative economics, I think are open to question. And I think as we start to enter new economic possibilities as a function of the multiverse, distributed working capabilities, distributed production capabilities, I think for the first time, there's a real question about the aggregative function of cities in this 21st century way. And I think we're not challenged with that. Most of the hypotheses I keep seeing of high-rise towers, high-dense human developments, when we should be talking about high-dense human footprints. How can we get the footprint of humanity to be denser? And that includes not just the habitable rooms, but actually the energy, waste, food systems to be actually much more significantly dense. And I think that's a fundamentally different quality of the city. And I think that is a real issue here, because I feel too much of the debate is very old world still, very much predicated on a very 19th century idea of urban density, which I don't think takes us home anywhere close home. And that's my provocative close to the end of this one, Sebastian. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there is something that is not, in my opinion, also not prominently enough in the discussion, is that global scale. I mean, if we do a sort of a mass balance equation, or if we try to assess what is the overall amount that is actually needed as a form of a calculation, even if it is a very broad calculation, then we actually very quickly come to the point that we can't continue with the strategies and the approaches that we are having right now. And there's also actually nothing at hand that can resolve this, right? And we have discussed this at some point. The question of institutions is also something that is important. Maybe we can get back to that at a later stage, maybe what kind of institutional change we need in order to address a scale of that magnitude, which is really global. Yeah. So thank you very much for your contribution here, and also the other three panelists. Now, dear audience, you have now gotten a first glance of the I4C conference outcome. We try to condense an event that featured over 300 individual sessions into 40 minutes, which is of course not possible. But nevertheless, we were hopefully able to raise a few spotlights on some of the questions and the outcome that came out of the conference. Now, what I would like to do now is to go a little bit to our host region and our host country, and by actually introducing our regional panelists. And I want to start with Dr. Mahdi, who is hopefully still with us online. Dr. Mahdi, as I mentioned, is the Secretary General of the Supreme Council for Planning and Development, and is the Project Director of the Country Action Program for UNDP in Kuwait. And he serves as a high-level government, serves on high-level government boards, committees such as the Public Authority for Industries, the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research, the Public Housing Welfare Authority, the National SME Fund, the economic fiscal reform, which is called, sorry for pronouncing this, ST Dama Committee, Fiscal Reform Committee, and also the Kuwait Master Plan 2040, which perhaps may also incorporate some of the things that we are raising here. Because yeah, we need to play way ahead, and of course the region is also one of the regions that is very much affected by climate change. And he heads the National Committee for the Implementation of the UN Agenda 2030, and he currently is a board member of the Anaya Hospital Management Company, responsible in privatizing the operation of the Johar Hospital. And yeah, there are many, I can see that Dr. Mahdi, you are quite engaged in many aspects of the Sustainable Development Agenda. You also received the People's First Leader Award in 2018, and you're an advisor to the Kuwait University Strategic Office in the past, so which makes you also, brings you close to the academic community, of course, and you served, I believe, as a Minister of Planning and Development Affairs in 2013. So welcome here at the panel, and sorry that I overlooked your presence at the beginning. This was not on purpose, but maybe due to the slightly chaotic start at the beginning of our session. Yeah. Now, recognizing my esteemed colleagues here present in the room, Professor Ahmed Rashed, who is, as I mentioned, a professor of architecture and former head of the architecture department at the British University in Egypt, and he has 35 years of academic and professional experiences, and he is the founding director of the Farouk El-Bas Center for Sustainable and Future Studies. He managed over 30 domestic and international projects in his professional career in domains of sustainability, heritage conservation, green development, sustainable tourism, architecture, engineering, urban planning, public participation, civil studies, and environmental impact assessment. And this is actually an interesting point. We need to talk more about heritage. And he also co-authored over 60 articles and manuscripts for scientific journals, etc. And then also Dr. Najib Shubash, who is, as I mentioned, a public health expert with 27 years serving the WHO in various capacities, and today he's still a senior advisor to the WHO, currently developing the regional strategy for digitalization of health services, and he is the president of the eHealth Development Association of Jordan, and the president of the Jordan Library and Information Association, and he's a frequent speaker at different global and regional forums on topics as diverse as digitalization and health, but also bioethics, which is of course an important topic in the 21st century, and he holds a doctorate from the University of Wales. So welcome to our panel. One moment. So I am picking hopefully the right page, yes. Yeah, so Professor Rashed, let me start with you. I wanted to ask you, of course, if you have any, if our discussion that the colleagues brought into this room on the I4C conference, if there's anything that sort of triggers a response from your side. So anything that you would like to say. And I mean, it would be very interesting for us to also have a bit of a regional perspective and to see how does that relate, you know, to the Arab states, to Egypt, to Jordan, to Kuwait. Yeah, so please, the floor is yours. Yeah, Yeah, we use one microphone. Okay, thank you for the signal.
Okay, good evening, everyone. First of all, yes, with the Innovate4Cities Conference, when we already have been invited or to participate as a regional creator within the region, the MENA region. And we decided that to have a colleagues or partners to work together. So we have Cairo University, Damyata Governorate, the Center of HRBC, which is for housing and building, in addition to the Ministry of Education. We have the Forum of Mediterranean Cities from Jordan and from the other cities. We was looking for something that it's not going to be, it's have a government, but it's going to be bottom-up approach. And we have some threatenings which we think about it. So for Damyata, we think for innovator, they are famous by furniture, and this is one of the things which all over the Arab world, the Damyata furniture, but they have already now started to have a furniture city to make it organized for the future, something like that. And they have the threatening of having the climate change, which is going to for the water sea, it's going to, we need to move the people from a certain part. So that was one of the challenges. The other one was for Luxor city itself. Yes, so if we think about innovative, and by the way, we are all here, it's an innovative city from the beginning when they started to think for the location for the mountain, for having the tombs and the east and the west and the Nile and everything. And yesterday when we were at the Khalek, we have to think about how they are innovative to create such a city to be for more than 3,000 years. So we have, who was in charge of the development of the city, which is now, after a few days, we have this kind of opening the Sphinx Avenue or something like that to give the point of view. In addition, on the other side, he was in charge of having the new universities all over the Egyptian new cities and how he's going to implement it for the step of having a new city. So this was, again, things which when we have this file and implemented on the 14th of October, it needs to have this kind of different point of views from all the parties which we are participating of. Again, there is kind of a gap sometimes between one place to another. So what is on our ground could be a ceiling for others, and what is a ceiling for others could be a ground. So that is one of the things which we have to think. So yes, many things is going to be discussed after tomorrow or something. On the strategic and on the global, but again, for every certain place, there will be kind of, as I said, challenges, and we said that yes, we need to make a kind of chance. There is a chance now, and we think about change and challenge. I used to say cha-cha-cha, something like that, between the three. So this was going to be something which it will be different, but again, as the whole community, the international community at the earth think that we have to make something for the climate change and to save the coming, for the coming generations, their options for the opportunity for the future. This is something which I think we are all share, and we are all able to participate by one way or another. This is a quick for this one, then probably I will talk about the heritage and other things.
Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to our audience and everybody around. In fact, the very inspiring discussion and the different ideas that were presented by different people on the Innovate4Cities Conference and the previous conference. I picked few things actually that are already being discussed and seriously taken into consideration. One of them is actually moving to a more knowledge society, meaning actually that we need more infrastructure for ICT, we need more research, we need more sort of action after the discussion and after we talk a lot. We need communities of practice, and all these are basic community, basic knowledge management issues. So when it comes to building a knowledge community, for example, we have the World Bank and we have WHO that has been actually pushing for much less labor work and much more intelligent work using the knowledge base that we have. WHO itself actually has been active in supporting research and supporting the creating an environment that will actually enhance research in health, and of course the social determinants of health, which the environment is an integral part of that, is one of the most important elements that were supported. And the endorsement of the SDGs, and the SDG number 3 in particular, actually, which almost has connection with all the other SDGs in terms of it is affecting and it is affected by the different SDGs that we can think of. The other important thing is actually in Egypt, for example, linking Cairo as a city in a network with other healthy cities program. So Cairo is actually one of, I think, 70 different cities, which include something like 300 million people actually, in terms of learning from each other and in terms of trying to share experience and share knowledge and share the different skills that different people have in the community. So the region itself actually is making real strides in terms of moving to a digital society, moving into the direction of much more knowledge, experience, and skills, soft skills in particular. I think yesterday we had a discussion, and somebody was mentioning that which is true. It's the easiest thing actually to put cables and infrastructure in the ground, satellites and all that. But the more difficult part is actually how and where you use these skills to enhance climate change, to reduce emission, for example, to add more on data transmission, on data moving rather than people moving in the streets and moving in cars and creating more problems for the earth. So that is basically the probably 3 or 4 messages I got actually from the description. Number one is we need more networking. We need much more knowledge translation. We need to make sure that people are actually on top of what we say and what we actually propose and all that. So they take that into consideration and they start implementing it. We would like to see more cities actually using data. I think it was mentioned that we have a lot of data. It's very typical. We have a lot of data, but we have much little information and definitely much less knowledge that we can actually base on that our action. So I think the Innovate4Cities, I think it's great to see the recommendations and try to translate them into action, and then see what cities can do in terms of data, in terms of networking, in terms of knowledge sharing, and all the different training events that are required for people to be more aware and to be more engaged in what they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mahdi, maybe you can share your thoughts and maybe also offer a perspective from Kuwait. Over to you.
Thank you very much, my dear, and I would like to greet everyone hearing me and from Kuwait. And I was planning to speak in Arabic, but it seemed that every single one here spoke in English, so I would go in English then. Now, there are many thoughts being said, but what took my attention is what Professor Inder Johan mentioned with regard to the mentality of the old world, but at the same time, we need to tackle a future problem. And there was a very good mentioning about being many governments, many cities are being mesmerized with creating cities with high-rise building and skyscrapers here and there, without taking in consideration other major issues. Now, let me start with what I understood from the objective of this roundtable is how to move beyond the science arena. So that moving beyond the science arena require what I call the policy making based on evidence. Now we have a lot of work being done. Now we need to set some regulating, operating policy in order to move forward. From a Kuwaiti perspective, we try to analyze this issue of policy making. I mean, there is a fundamental problem before we specifically talk about the urban policy or the city policy surrounding building cities or operating cities or financing cities. The underlying fundamental issue is the policy making process itself. In the region, we have an issue, a major issue in the policy making process, starting from setting up the policy till implementation, feedback, and feed it back to the system. The infrastructure for the policy making seem to be is not mature enough. And it came to my surprise that even in the developed world, they still have issues when it comes for the implementation or taking these policy forward. I understand that when democracy fits in, we have this challenge in Kuwait. There are so many good policy being trapped into political navigation process that did not get out in the way that they're supposed to, and they are what I call a mutated policy. Now let me focus on the city aspect of it. Kuwait is a one city state, and we moved from that principle of one city state or that concept in the fourth master plan. We called it Smart Kuwait. Smart Kuwait was the motto of the fourth master plan. We are very proud that we did our first plan in the 50s and the second master plan the 70s, and then in the 90s we had the third one. The fourth one, which is coming out soon, it's in the 2022, will be fully announced. We are moving toward one city state to more creation of secondary cities. Although that type of philosophy being approved and was applauded everywhere, still you can see some tendency to centralize the services toward the capital. So that the attachment from the capital seems to be very challenging, that you will be required to create very much a decentralized city. I do believe that with the use of technology, any citizen living in any secondary city will be definitely fully served within one city without let me put it this way, the need to travel to the capital. Currently in Kuwait, this seems to be not feasible to many because they believe that it's a very small country. You can drive from north to south, east to west in an hour or two, which is nothing compared to other countries in the region. However, we are trying to emphasize more and more the transformation to more of a secondary city. Now, this is all being done in compatibility with what we call the Sustainable Development Goal. I would like to share one slide, if you allow me, if you don't mind. So allow me to share that slide just to show you how our policy making led us to formalize what we call the Kuwait Vision 2035, which give more of the private sector to be enabled by a proper government, a transparent government, energetic government. I'm not sure that I caught, but I guess it was Mr. Rodas. He mentioned very interesting engagement of the private sector when it comes to cities. This is not really an easy thing. When I'm asking for sharing one slide, I mean, do you allow it or not here?
Please go ahead, please. Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, I cannot because they disabled the sharing anyway. Okay, now getting the private sector engaged, it seemed to be very tricky. Private sector required many conditions in order for them to be engaged fully. So we came up with this public-private people partnership model, is to get the private sector, public sector, as well 50% of whatever commercial establishment happened to be issued as an IPO, initial public offering, after the establishment of these business entities or business vehicle. So getting the private sector to be engaged, there were a lot of discussion on how far you want to provide the private sector with the support. And the private sector has its own requirement. They don't come for free. They are profit seeking, but at the same time, you want to get their efficiency and their vast resources, which governments sometimes they don't have, which is the agility of implementation. So that type of a private sector engagement were done through what I call a public-private partnership. So I do agree with what Rodas mentioned when it comes for getting into what I call private sector to be engaged. However, with one condition is the government will work as an enabling government. So I do believe that given my 5 minutes, I will stop here. And thank you very much. I didn't have a chance to show you the slide. The slide is a set of policy and outcome integrated within an ecosystem, waste treatment, whether solid or water. I'm glad that you mentioned mass balance. You sound as a chemical engineer to me when you mentioned the mass balances. But yes, if you are running into mass balances of that situation, we look at the city from a 360 degree, including the waste, including the air quality, including transportation, and all of these architectural pillars and aspects. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mahdi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Mahdi. Sorry, we try to allow you. I mean, I would definitely. There is a possibility for your slide, but I think there is a slight technical issue that we were not able to resolve. Apologies again for that. But thank you for the intervention, also for the remarks that you made and the interesting perspective from Kuwait. And it's quite interesting for me to notice that Kuwait is, which is, like you say, a city-state, is also actually looking into secondary cities, which is quite an important topic. I mean, we have discussed this for Egypt also, the question of secondary cities, because Cairo is a big sort of a hub, and what happens actually to the secondary cities and what keeps people maybe in secondary cities and creates opportunities for them there. Yeah, but I wanted to maybe try to see if there is any question in the audience here. Want to raise your hand? Yeah, we have one question. We can take more if there is any. Okay, so we have one question in the room. Now I wanted to ask the online audience. Now you see me sitting here with my analog equipment. I wanted to ask you if you could possibly, if you have any questions to any of the panelists, to put them in the chat. And I hope our technical team will be able to relay them if they are coming in the questions. Yeah, but let's take a question from the floor.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, the panel, for the fruitful presentation. Actually, I'm going to share with you some thoughts that I have been gathered while you were presenting your presentation, and I would like to share. I'm not sure who should I address this, but let's open it for all. Do we need to divide our goal, which is reducing the carbon dioxide emissions, into small goals? Do we need to identify two or even one action and focus on, or we need to work parallel? Do we need to identify our target groups? Do we need to talk to government, private sector, or citizens? Because I believe that cities suffers from many things, but they are suffer differently. According to the nature of each city. In order to meet the needs of, to meet the problems or face the problems of each cities, we need to tailored or customized the solution for each city, or is it something common between all the cities? Is it expensive? I mean, if we are asking the private sector to do something or to take an action, is it expensive for him, or is it it's not expensive if we compare it to the advantage of this, even on the long term, not the short term? I guess from my point of view that we need more awareness on the steps and the mitigation of the current situation, and to put plans to avoid more emissions in the future. And we need as well to trust ourselves and to be confident, because we as a word, or the word success or achieve success in overcoming the pandemic, we have to use this experience and how the countries cooperate together. How they, for example, they were cooperating in the vaccine and the intervention of the vaccine. How they were supporting each other by delivering hygiene kits and all the information and applying measures between the airports and travels. And so from the experience we faced in the pandemic, which was a common problem that we all faced, and we all felt that maybe all of us will be hurt from this. We managed to find a way. So I believe that we need to trust ourselves and trust our governments, our citizens, that we can overcome this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the remark. Your question was whether the SDG on climate change should be somewhat broken down, and if we needed maybe a more accentuated, differentiated agenda, right, with specific goals. Okay, now there was another question. Welcome.
Yeah, I thank you for the presentation, the key messages, the solutions and everything. I am just interested in knowing the opportunities that are offered by the conference. Any capacity building opportunities, partnership financing, what opportunities are there? Because I mean, you're coming to give us the outcome of the conference. I would like to know that. Okay.
Excellent point. One third question we can take. Maybe is there any question in the from the online audience? Yeah, maybe I can have a look. I give you the microphone. Maybe you can.
So the question is, how can our local regional government deal with the dynamically changing climate scenario, especially when cascading disasters are recurring and increasing in intensity and frequency?
Yeah, that's the central question, the big $1 million question. So, okay, maybe we can play the ball back to our online panel and see if they have any response to that. Is there anyone who would like to jump in? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, we had 3 questions. One was on the question of the indicators and the sort of breaking down of the SDG goals and the agenda in that sense. The other question was capacity building as an outcome of the conference and the sort of benefit that is directly coming. And the third question was more complicated, the question perhaps how local government can actually respond when the situation gets more grim. Yeah, maybe Dr. Khaled, you first, and then the other panelists, please go ahead. Over.
I will address only 2 points. The one regarding on breaking the goals, which I don't believe this is the right approach. We tried it in Kuwait, didn't work out. This is that requires very much of a holistic approach. And I keep telling everybody, do not focus on the SDG goals, focus on your national implementation, national policy implementation. These SDG goals will come as byproduct. It's a holistic approach. You cannot do any disintegration. So you need to take it as a whole. For example, if you want to go and cut the CO2 emissions, for example, or reduce it, you need to play it into 3-4 parallel paths. You need to work out yourself in the renewable energy. You need to think about the CO2 capturing. You need to play it with the improving the indigenous life and environment or biodiversity. So you have to take it as a 360. A single approach focusing on one or taking them in sequence will not do the job. Private sector. I served in the private sector for some time, and I remember a very interesting case. The Kuwaiti government at that time, I was not in the government, I was in the private sector as a chairman of a recycle company. They came and invited us into solving the tires problem in the country. So we gave our own proposals, and later I said, well, there are some requirements. In the private sector, you have to set your requirement from the government. Said one requirement, one is we require, for example, a gate fees or tipping fees or whatever fees that at that time. I remember the government official response at that time. Do you know what he said? He said, I'm giving you the waste. It is the national treasure. I said, you know what? Keep your national treasure to you. Private sector, they don't think the way government officials think. It's a different vocabulary. It's a different paradigm. You need to understand what is it for him, for her in the private sector, and what is it for you. Look at, as a government official, my interest is the directed for the public good, for the public goodness, to improving life. Now there are so many, let me put it this way, more of a socio-economic, but for the private sector, he does care or she does care in the private sector about many things, but there is one major thing that the private sector think of. Their financial statement should look nice, and the board, when they meet, and they need to announce some profit, some earning, then you need to come up with a shared platform that actually a win-win situation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Win-win situation. Yeah, I think that is very important. Thank you for this remark. Let me be efficient, and I wanted to direct the question of the sort of outcome capacity building to Professor Bai, because she is also a teacher. Maybe you feel comfortable answering the question. Over.
Thank you. Probably Seth is in a better position to answer this question, because as I understand, the question is specifically directed to what sort of opportunities I4C actually is offering in terms of capacity building, if I understand it correctly.
Okay, Seth, please.
Yeah, happy to jump in. The capacity building is a massive issue based on all the other comments that we've heard today. But the issue is really how do we start empowering the people in the places that they're at now? And most importantly, how do we give them the information in a way that they can understand it and accept it, which is, again, one of the major components of the I4C. Indy mentioned, we've known a lot of this stuff for a long time, and the IPCC has been putting out, state-of-the-art science for a long time. Part of the problem is that information and data is inaccessible in its current form to policymakers. They don't know what that means. They're not going to have the time to pick up a 1,500-page scientifically written document with 3,000 citations and understand what to do with it. It's an issue of translation. And the first thing before we talk about all the systemic things that do need to happen and occur in academia, in business classes around the world, et cetera, the number one thing is that we've got to translate and give the content to the people that currently are in those positions to empower it. And we have that information. It's just an issue of translation. Put it in the right perspective, put it in the right context, give it to them at the right time. That's the other thing. A lot of the process that we have, take a long time. Cities and their policy processes are on like a 6-month cycle. Entire administrations, as Mauricio will tell you, roll over every 4 years. The speed with which this information needs to be provided is at a radically different pace if we're going to achieve this. It's just my initial reaction to that question.
Okay. Mauricio, would you like to add to that?
Yes, thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, I think the issue of capacity building is fundamental. And I would like to point out something that was mentioned before, which is, the reality that medium and small size cities face. They, of course, have a lot of problems regarding capacity building. They have a lot of problems regarding project preparation capacity. And I think that we should be focusing more on how to support medium and small size cities. Because those are the ones that will be growing the most during the next several years. So we really need to come up with ways in which the international community can provide technical assistance mechanisms for medium and small cities in the developing world. I think this is very important because those, again, are the ones that will be growing the most. And I mean, if you look at data, like, for example, according to the World Bank, only 20% out of the 500 largest cities in the developing world are deemed credit-worthy. Only 20% of the largest 500 cities in the developing world are deemed credit-worthy. Can you imagine what the situation is for medium and small cities? It is, of course, much worse. So that's the kind of everyday problem that these kind of cities are facing. And of course, a lot of it has to do with capacity building. I think this is a key issue to discuss.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indy, I feel tempted to hear your views.
So I think my contribution would be, I think we need to start to think about a next generation IMF for cities. I'm going to be really straight and bold about this. We need new monetary institutions at a global level that are able to deal with actually the problem, the scale of the transition that's required. And that monetary model isn't going to be debt or equity in this traditional format. Like I say, most of these instruments are not able to deal with the fact that most of the risk that we're talking about is yet not crystallized. So traditional debt mechanisms aren't going to take us home on this format. So we need to start to think at a whole new institutional scale level. We need to radically improve our decision-making capability. As Seth was rightly pointing out, the scale and speed of the information, the scale of risks are not yet well understood, and we're not responding in an integrated way. My final point is, climate change is a symptom of a problem. It's not the problem itself. And this is a really tough bit. It's a very big symptom, but it's a symptom. Because the structural issue is actually how we have created an economic model and a value model which actually is generating huge externalities in our world around us. And those huge externalities can be seen in air pollution, can be seen in plastic pollution, can be seen in biodiversity losses, and can also be seen in CO2 impacts. So everything around us is manifesting the same structural problem. And if you go back to the root of it, I think we have to start to think much more structurally about the transition. And that, I think, is going to be about a new theory of value creation, a new theory of how we make decisions, and a new theory of capitalization. And the capitalization, we need to start to go back to places like the Marshall Fund when it was deployed in Italy and how it was structured for transition. We need to go back to large-scale capital restructuring, and that's going to be required. So what would a new institution for financing city change look like globally? I think that's the scale of institutional design we need to be thinking about if we're going to take this problem seriously. And remember, the risks are cascading. So if you have cities failing, what we need to talk about is whole cities failing. It won't be one or two cities failing. As climate change occurs, and we're probably already in the pathway of that, we're going to see whole cities failing. That's going to drive large-scale transnational movement of people. So we need to start to think about this at the transnational scale of what we're in the middle of. Because without recognizing that, I think we're really talking about tinkering with our cities and putting heat pumps at the bottom of our city to think we deal with the scale of the challenge. I mean, we're nowhere close. Mm-hmm. So I think this is a really big moment for our city futures, and we need to start to be thinking about it in much more.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to getting a little more into the also the question of financing and the institutions, and that we basically need to think the whole thing, rethink the whole thing with new institutions at scale, and also rethinking our financial models or financing models for tackling climate change. Now, as a last speaker, I would like to give the floor to Xuemei for 2 minutes, a short intervention. And thank you very much for staying put with us for so long. I think it is already past 1 or 2 over there in Canberra.
Yes, it's 1:30 in the morning, so my brain is a bit slow. You have to, put up with me. So I would like to briefly respond to the third very important question of how can our local regional government can deal with this, increasing and cascading disaster. So if I speak as a researcher, I would really say, we really need to understand the interlinkages, the cascading chain of reactions, and then related in relation to the uncertainties first. But for a practitioner, there is really no time to wait for the outcome of this kind of scientific result. So my plea to practitioners would really be engage and work together with scientists. I mean, usually we say this to the scientists, scientists have to work with practitioners, but this has to be a two-way traffic. The practitioners has also to reach out and work with scientists and really initiate at least, I think in my mind, 2 lines of response here. The first one is really need to have, both short-term emergency response preparedness type of work, so that you can be prepared and quickly adjust and adapt to the looming disasters and risks, and really need to be prepared to adapt your plan based on lessons that are occurring almost every day from cities in all around the world. But on the other hand, you also need to really have a very long-term focus and keep your eye into the, far into the horizon, and try to build up resilience and capacity to adapt, including both some of the soft elements, for example, the social, cultural, institutional adaptive capacity. Also, even including, how can you actually enhance the awareness and shift the value within your city, for example, as well as some of the hard element of this adaptiveness. For example, how can you consider your key infrastructures to be more resilient, and how can you make it a bit more adaptive to, to future changes? And I think one of the things we have learned during the COVID-19, which is also related to the other question, I believe, on whether, and how the countries should work together question, is really the importance of these intercity networks or cities, working together really in a meaningful way. And we really proposed in an article published last year in Nature again, really calling for building this network resilience, we call, through the city networks. Because if you look at during the initial occurrence of COVID-19 in Wuhan, the city has received lots of incoming aid, medical, equipment and things like that from the Wuhan sister cities from all around the world. And once the city started to recover, the city started sending out aid to all these sister cities again, all around the world. And it's really amazing to see this kind of interconnectedness. And I think it's also in the benefit and interest for cities to do this kind of networking, actually. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a good moment to also conclude our discussion. Global solidarity is one key element that we require when tackling climate change, when adapting cities to climate resilience. And yeah, this was also a good closing remark in a sense. Thank you, first of all, the audience to bear with us for the delay and the slightly chaotic start. Thank you, dear online panelists, for being here and also for bearing with us, for making time during your busy travel schedule and late at night. And I like your backdrop, Indy. Yeah, thank you for the distinguished panelists here and for your contribution. I hope it was interesting, and I hope to see you soon in person or online. Thank you.